This podcast is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Okay, so I'm mainly going to be exploring 3 of the early Buddhist women in this talk. So we're going to be looking at Mahapajapati Gautami, Khema, and Upalavanna. So on the shrine here, we've got 3 images of early Buddhist women. Now, they're all fairly recent, but actually, back at that point, 2,500 years ago, actually, ancient India wasn't a culture that created representations of human beings. So this is why the Buddha in the early records, he's represented by a footprint or a wheel or the leaf of a Bodhi tree. It just wasn't a culture that thought in terms of drawing images of humans. And that only came quite a lot later. So every time we see an image of a Buddha, it's not what the Buddha looked like. It's an imagining that is trying to communicate to us, what would it be like? Like, what would enlightenment look like? So, a Buddha is just trying to say, what if we were that calm, that grounded, that emotionally positive at every moment in our life? So every image is trying to communicate something about the nature of awakening. And so it's just the same for these images of the early Buddhist women. So this very sort of East Asian airbrush style one, this is supposed to be Yashodhara, who's the Buddha's wife, who becomes an arahant in her own right. And the other 2 are Mahapajapati Gautami, who we're about to hear about. And I particularly love this image that we've got in the middle. It's just like she's looking at you. She's got her begging bowl, which is contentment. So that's just like, whatever life places in your begging bowl, that's what you just say, that's what's there. That's what's on my plate. That's what's presenting. So it's an image of contentment and freedom. And the way she just sort of looks very directly, it's like, it's a very compassionate gaze, but also kind of, to me there's something where her compassion is also challenging. She's sort of saying, look, this is freedom. How about you? So you probably can't see it that well from the sides, but maybe at some point when there isn't something going on in here, you just want to come and sort of look into Mahapajapati Gautami's eyes and just see, well, what is it she seems to be saying to you? So Mahapajapati, let's see. So right, now I need to tell you the structure of what we're going to do, okay? The structure, so I'm going to say some things about Mahapajapati Gautami, and then I'm going to read out the description of her parinibbana, the point where she just completely lets go of physical existence. So it looks like death, but it's not death as we know it. And then what we're going to do is chant the Prajnaparamita mantra. So, we've got Prajnaparamita as a much later embodiment, female embodiment of wisdom. And Prajnaparamita is called the mother of all the Buddhas, because every Buddha, past, present, future, whatever gender, whatever identity, all arrive at awakening by the same perfect wisdom, which is not clinging to anything in the world. So we'll chant Prajnaparamitas mantra. And after that, we'll sit for a couple of minutes and I'll carry on talking. So, yes. But let's give you a bit of information about Mahaprajapati Gautami. You can't say it too quickly, otherwise your tongue falls over. So you might easily know of her as the woman that brought the Buddha up. So the Buddha's mother died at childbirth, and Mahaprajapati Gautami is her younger sister. So her sister died, leaving this little baby, and she was the woman that nursed the Buddha, brought him up, took care of him. So she's like the Buddha's mother. And the Buddha, of course, as we know, leaves home, goes on his quest, becomes enlightened, and then when he's enlightened, he's travelling around ancient India, and he's just sharing with whoever will listen the way to awakening. And at some point, he goes back to his old town, his old clan, where his father, Sudana, something like that, is king. And he obviously has quite a strong response there, because it just becomes a thing among the Shakyan clan that lots and lots of people want to go forth and they want to follow the Buddha. So his son Rahula goes forth and follows him. He has cousins, he has kinsmen of all sorts, and they all abandon the household life and they want to follow the Buddha. And in fact, you end up, this is off topic, you end up with arguments in the households about, it's not fit, no one has gone forth from our family, and yet we are Shakyans too, so will it be you or me? Yeah. And so then there the Buddha is visiting his old clan, his old family. And then one day his mother, not his mother, Mahaprajapati Gautami, but this woman that has been effectively his mother, and says, and I want to go forth too. And we're going to look at more detail about what happens at that point, because Mahaprajapati Gautami becomes the first bhikkhuni. So she founds the lineage of ordained female Buddhist practitioners. And a little bit later we're going to go into the ins and outs about how that happens. It's slightly complex. But afterwards she practices very sincerely and she becomes awakened. It's happened for many men and women at the time of the Buddha. So she becomes enlightened and she becomes a teacher in her own right. So quite often she's described as, and Mahaprajapati Gautami was residing at Vaishali in the squirrel's feeding ground or something like this. And she was residing there with 500 bhikkhunis, all of whom had extinguished their taints. So like 500 women practitioners who were all arahants. So she becomes both the head of the women's Sangha and a teacher and a leader in her own right. So we're now going to hear a text which Bhikkhu Analayo has translated from the Chinese. Now, information about this. We're probably mostly familiar with the stories, the earliest stories of the Buddha, coming from what's called the Pali Canon. So in a language called Pali, and it's been preserved in places like Sri Lanka, for instance. Pali isn't what the Buddha spoke. So these are oral traditions that were passed down for at least 500 years from person to person to person before being written down. And the Pali tradition is only one strand of that. And what's happening now is that other strands are being uncovered and translated into European languages. I mean, I don't suppose in China they were forgotten, it's just that we didn't know about them. So there's a whole load in Chinese, but it's not that they're translations of Pali. Do you see what I mean? It's like they're a lineage in their own right. And then there's other ones as well. There's some in Tibetan, there's some in Gandhari, there's some other fragments, but nothing as extensive as the Chinese. So Analayo's doing all this translation, and what he's finding is like sort of parallel text. So some of the stories are completely different, and some of them it's like you can tell it's the same story, but it's like it's a parallel, and it might bring out different things, or it might be different, or and sometimes there's something completely new. Now, I looked to see if he was specific about it, but I think this story of the parinibbana of Mahapajapati, I don't think there's a Pali equivalent, although he doesn't say there isn't, but then he doesn't say there is either. So, right. So tune back into Mahapajapati Gautami as leader, great spiritual teacher, leading many to awakening. And it's getting right to the end of the Buddha's life, and the Buddha's saying, I'm going to be attaining parinibbana soon, I'm going to be dying. And he's 80, so imagine how old his aunt is who brought him up. So, but apparently she is still alive, so she must be like really ancient, in her 90s at least. And she says, actually, it's my time to reach parinibbana as well. So this is what happens. Thus have I heard. At one time, the Buddha was staying in Vaishali, being in the company of a great group of 500 monks. At that time, Mahapajapati was dwelling in the Kutagarasala in Vaishali, being in the company of a great group of 500 nuns, all of whom were arahants, with their influxes eradicated. And then there's the bit where Mahapajapati goes to the Buddha and basically takes her leave and says, I'm going to die and I'm not going to see you again. And she returns to the community of nuns and says, I now wish to enter into the unconditioned element of nirvana. She closed the door of the oration hall, hit the gong, put down her sitting cloth in an open place, and soared up into the empty sky. While sitting, lying down, standing and walking in the empty sky, from her body burning flames came out. From her lower body smoke came out. From her upper body fire came out. From her lower body water came out. From her upper body smoke came out. Her whole body released flames. Her whole body released smoke. Her whole body released water. From the front of her body, fire came out. From the back of her body, water came out. From her whole body, fire came out, and from her whole body, water came out. When Mahapajapati had performed many transformations, she returned to her original seat to sit down cross-legged, with straight body and straight mind, collecting mindfulness in front. She entered the first dhyana, the second dhyana, the third, the fourth. Then she enters the formless dhyanas, the sphere of infinite space, of infinite consciousness, of no thingness, of neither perception nor non-perception. She entered the cessation of perception and knowing. Then she descended the formless dhyanas. She descended the lower dhyanas. And from first dhyana, she comes back up again through the first 4 dhyanas. And having entered the 4th dhyana, she in turn entered complete nibbana. At that time, there was a great earthquake in the world. The east rose up and the west sank down. The west rose up and the east sank down. The 4 sides rose up and the centre sank down. And on all 4 sides, a cool breeze arose. Some celestials in the sky danced and made music. Some celestials of the sensual sphere were crying in grief, which was like timely rain that falls from the sky in a month of the spring season. The sublime celestials scattered various lotus fragrances and sandalwood powder on her body. And after that time, a great stupa was erected on that site, and the remains of Maha Prajapati Gautami and her nuns were honoured, revered, and worshipped at that place. So, if you're familiar with descriptions of the Buddha's parinibbana, you'll notice that the description of Maha Prajapati's is actually very, very similar. And the Buddha is also described, not at that point, but at a different point, of performing what's called the twin miracle with fire and water coming out of his body and levitating. And you can also see echoes of Dakinis, you know, the way she's dancing in the air and performing all these transformations in the blue sky. Now, when Analayo comments on things like this, he says, oh, well, these are probably a bit later than the more literal records of, like, there they were living and then they walked here and then they had this conversation. And he talks about, like, miracles and levitation as a tendency to literalism. So, now, I think I'd see it a bit differently to that. I think I'd see it more like, how do you communicate what it is to encounter a freed consciousness? Like, how do you actually communicate what the inner experience, like what happens to our minds when they open up? How do you give that sense to somebody who doesn't have that in their experience? Because if you say, what does it look like? Well, it looks like they sit on a cushion and their eyes are shut. Doesn't look that exciting, does it? Whereas, to me, it's more like it's trying to give dramatic enactment to an inner experience of complete freedom, complete liberation. And the other thing that seems to come out quite clearly is that Maha Prajapati Gautami was considered a great and revered practitioner. Like, you cannot hear that text and think, oh, this is somebody that was dismissed because she was a woman. That's not the situation. And in that book I showed you last night, Alice Collett, I Hear Her Words, she talks about this trajectory in Buddhist texts where the earlier ones are actually much more, what do you say? They are more likely to honour women and have an even-handed approach. And then as you go through the centuries, you get much more androcentrism and misogyny coming in. But not everywhere in the tradition. So we're looking at a tradition that has different parts to it because different cultures, different people have produced it. But even hundreds of years later, when the Chinese pilgrim Xuanzang is visiting India, he mentions this great stupa marking the place of the parinibbana of Mahapajapati Gautami. So even, hundreds and hundreds of years later, like when was Xuanzang? 5th century? Something like that. Let's say 5th century. So this is like 1,000 years later, that place is still a place of reverence for Mahapajapati Gautami. Okay, so now we get to a slightly more controversial bit. So there's a sutta called the Gautami Sutta, which has had a huge amount of attention. I'll come back to that. Which has had a huge amount of attention. And it's the one where it's in the Pali Canon, so it's been known to the West for quite a long time. And it describes Mahapajapati Gautami asking to go forth from the household life. And the story as it's come down to us in that rendition is, here we go. So the Buddha's at Kapilavastu, that's the Shakyan city, and Mahapajapati Gautami comes to him and says, please let females gain the going forth to homelessness in the teaching and training proclaimed by the Buddha. And the Buddha says, enough, Gautami, don't ask for this. And she asks 3 times and the Buddha says no. And then the Buddha leaves Kapilavastu, goes to Vaishali. And then the text says, Mahapajapati Gautami had her hair shaved and dressed in ochre robes. Together with several Shakyan ladies, she set out for Vaishali. Then she stood crying outside the gate, her feet swollen, her limbs covered with dust, miserable and sad, with tearful face. Venerable Ananda saw her standing there and said, Gautami, why do you stand crying outside the gate? Etc. Honourable Ananda, it is because the Buddha is not permitting females to go forth. And Ananda, who just sounds like such a great guy, goes to the Buddha and says, look, this is what's happening. Can she not go forth? And the Buddha says no to Ananda 3 times. And then Ananda thinks, right, I must try another tack, and says, you owe her a debt of gratitude. She took care of you when you were a child. Where would you be if she had not looked after you? And then the Buddha says, okay, she can go forth if she accepts these 8 rules. And the 8 rules basically say that the community of nuns are subject to the community of monks. So let's have an example. A nun, even if ordained for 100 years, should bow down to a monk ordained for 1 day. I love that face. for instance, nuns are forbidden to criticise monks, but it's fine for monks to criticise nuns. Okay, and they kind of go on like that. So just remember what I was saying last night about make a choice whether you're going to take the righteous indignation route, okay? So, like, I'm telling you this because this is what the Sutta tells us, not because I'm saying I think this is a great plan. All right, we're about to unpack the information, more information about this. Okay. Oh yes. And the bad bit hasn't finished yet either. So then Ananda goes off and says to Mahaprajapati, Gotami, basically, this is the deal. And she says, that's fantastic. And she says, I'm going to wear it like somebody's given me a wreath of lotuses around my head. You think, okay. Anyhow. And then Ananda goes back to the Buddha. And the Buddha says, the Sangha won't last as long because women have been given the going forth. Okay. So this is the Pali text as has been passed down. All right? Okay, so I have to say, Analayo's take on it is, this is conservative Brahminical values coming in. It's a late addition. There's another scholar, Richard Gombrich, who reckons the same. There are various reasons why that is a possibility, which I'm not going to go into for reasons of time. And Analayo talks about, actually it's just very, very interesting. The Dharma is disruptive to society. There's no two ways about it. Societies want you to sit in your box in that society and do whatever the thing is that is the thing you ought to be doing in that society. And the Dharma says, don't let anything get in the way of your freedom. Liberation, the ending of suffering, and then sharing that is what our lives should be about, not fitting in boxes that your particular society has prescribed for you. And yet, the Dharma as a teaching and as a Sangha, it can only be passed on in a society if it's not. It's very hard to keep teaching something that goes against the grain of what your whole society is teaching. So what happens in different societies is you can see different corners being taken off the Dharma to try and make it more acceptable. So an example at the moment, for instance, would be secular mindfulness. So, marvellous thing, secular mindfulness, benefiting many people. What does it do? It shaves off all the bits of the Dharma that don't fit in to a current secular, anti-religious mode of thinking. So we can look back and we can see how the Dharma was distorted by androcentrism, by misogyny in the past. But it's also very interesting to look at, well, what parts of the Dharma feel unacceptable today? So definitely one of them that's very countercultural is worship, reverence, respect. And another is renunciation. The idea that actually you can't have everything. That letting go of things is actually peace. And we're going to see this in one of the other texts that's coming up. Because we want to think we can have it all. We can have all the luxury goods. We can have the lovely living situation. We can have our career. We can have our families. We can have absolutely everything we want. And that's our right. We shouldn't have to say no to anything. Whereas actually, if you say yes to something, you're always saying no to something else. And each of us in our lives, we're choosing, well, actually, this is what I want to say yes to, and what do I want to say no to? It's not actually possible to have everything. Okay, so Analayo, guess what, has found a Chinese parallel that's a bit different. Where's the parallel? So in this Chinese version, Mahapajapati is asking the Buddha, and I missed the key bit in the Pali one. Ananda, when Ananda goes to the Buddha to say, can she go forth? He starts off by saying, well, can women become completely and perfectly enlightened? And the Buddha says, yes. So there's never any question about women not being able to become enlightened. Now in this one, Mahapajapati Gautami says, can women attain the fourth fruit, which is enlightenment? And then she says, well, can women leave the home out of faith and become homeless? To train in the path in this right teaching and discipline. And what the Buddha says is slightly different. He says, wait, Gautami, do not have this thought. Shave your hair off, put on monastic robes, and for your whole life practice the holy life in purity. But he says, don't leave home to do it. Do it at home. Now, there's a whole load of cultural context, because actually, nobody is going to know. First, nobody's going to know what actually happened. And second, nobody's going to know what the Buddha was thinking. But you can sort of ask yourself, is it probable that the Buddha would say women can't go forth because of prejudice against women? Like a fully, completely enlightened being, is that actually probable? That's what would happen. Now, at that time, culturally, if you were a woman, you were considered the property of your male relations. So you belonged to your husband or your father or your son or your brothers. And if you didn't belong to a man, basically you were just fair game for any bloke that wanted to basically rape you, because you weren't under the protection of a man. So this is the cultural context in which the woman that's brought the Buddha up is saying, can I go forth? So a different interpretation would be, the Buddha's thinking, God, I really want women to be able to practice, but how's this going to work? The responsibility of having a load of women wandering around the countryside, not under the protection of a man. And this does actually happen. So after the Order of Nuns starts, there's all sorts of... what you get it in the Vinaya, because that's where the rules are created. So, for instance, there were two nuns travelling together. They came to a river, and there was a ferry over the river. And the ferryman said, I can only take one of you at a time. So they go one at a time. Basically, they both get raped in the middle of the river by this guy. So then a rule gets made for the Order of Nuns. No one is to cross a river by themselves. Somebody a nun doing solitary retreat gets raped. It's actually a Palavana, who we're going to get onto. And then it said, okay, nuns need to practice in groups for their own safety. So do you see about there being a whole kind of cultural context about concern for the safety of women going forth that would be different to, we're just going to say no for the hell of it. Okay, right, so I think I'm... so if you're more interested in this, Analayo has a load of extra points, and also Alice Collett has extra points. So if you want to kind of look more into that, keep on, feel free to kind of look further. But a direction that all of them go actually is saying, well, do you just focus on that one text that says the Buddha said no, and then he said these rules that subjugated them to the monks? Oh, yeah, so the idea of the rules would then be, if the wider society saw the nuns as essentially being the property of the monks, they then wouldn't mess with them, because they then fitted in a category that they understood. Do you see what I mean? So essentially, if the nuns were seen as being under the protection of the monks, then this is why it could have been set up like that, for their safety, not because there was some kind of reason that women couldn't get enlightened, or that it was going to be a problem in, some other way. And if we look at it in the light of like the other early texts, actually it's not like those sort of attitudes, these kind of like later Brahminical, these kind of conservative Brahminical attitudes. You don't particularly see this. I mean, what you do see is, there's a whole sutta where the Buddha rejoices in different bhikkhunis and says, this one's amazing because of this, and this one's amazing because of that, and, this one's fantastic because of the other thing. Very often the Buddha talks about his teaching and what he's trying to do in terms of the 4 assemblies. And this is the monks that have gone forth into homelessness, the nuns that have gone forth into homelessness, the lay women who are practicing at home, and the lay men who are practicing at home. And the same terms will be used for them. And so the Buddha sees it as an integral part of his dispensation, his teaching, that it's for everyone. He doesn't make a distinction between. So here's a bit that gets repeated quite a number of times in the Pali Canon. So from this bit is from the Parinibbana Sutta, just before the Buddha finally dies or goes into Parinibbana. And he goes through the different assemblies, and he says he's talking to Mara. So Mara, very important figure in these early Buddhist texts, the embodiment of everything that holds us back. And he doesn't let up when the Buddha gets enlightened. He keeps on popping up to him at key moments and saying undermining things. So the Buddha's actually talking to Mara, and he's saying, I will not pass into final nibbana until I have bhikkhuni disciples, women ordained, who are competent, well-trained, confident, learned, upholders of the Dharma, practicing in accordance with the Dharma, practicing properly, conducting themselves in accordance with the Dharma, who have learned their teacher's doctrine and can explain it, teach it, describe it, establish it, disclose it, analyse it, he keeps going, and can teach the compelling Dharma. And so then when he's dying, he's saying, I can die because this is the case, because this is what the order of nuns looks like, this is what the order of monks looks like. Uses exactly the same words for the monks as for the nuns. Okay, now we're going to do a lightning run around Khema and Upalavanna. So just as the Buddha was the head of the order of bhikkhus and Mahapajapati Gotami was the head of the order of bhikkhunis. So the Buddha has 2 great disciples, Shariputra and Maudgalyana. And Mahapajapati Gotami has 2 great disciples, and they are called Khema and Upalavanna. And interestingly, in the Sri Lankan tradition, both the pairs of disciples, they're described as one of them has very fair skin and one of them has very dark skin. And again, it's just trying to get over this, actually nobody knows what they look like, but it's just trying to get over this idea of like the Dharma is for everyone. The Dharma is for everyone. And Khema is greatest in wisdom and eloquence and teaching the Dharma. And Upalavanna is greatest in meditation, psychic abilities and magical powers.
Cool.
Yeah, cool, you're so right. So there's a story where Kema gets visited by King Pasenadi. So again, you'll see, this is another story where, the King Pasenadi has sent his minister out. So I want to visit a holy man. Go and have a look and see who there is I can visit. And the minister comes back and says, well, I don't think you'd want to visit any of the men, but there's this Bhikkhuni, and she is revered and she's known for her wisdom. Kema, Your Majesty should visit her. So he goes along to visit Kema. A good report concerning this revered lady has spread about thus. She is wise, competent, intelligent, learned, a splendid speaker, ingenious. Let your Majesty visit her. So King Pasenadi goes to see her, pays homage to her, sits down at one side, and then asks his questions, saying, how is it, revered lady? And he asks these classic questions which seem to really bother ancient Indians. And I must say, I've never had, in all the years of teaching at Taraloka, no one's ever come up to me and had this as their burning question they wanted to ask. But anyway, it seems to be a burning question in those times. Does the Tathagata exist after death? Do they not exist after death? Do they both exist and not exist after death? Do they neither exist nor not exist after death? Is that anyone's burning question? I think it was a society of a philosophical bent. But it is a question about existence and about, can we know the nature of enlightenment? Does it fit in our categories? Is it that we go to a heaven and we're going to be really, really happy ever after when we get enlightened? Or is it that we just completely stop existing and there's kind of nothingness? Or is it neither of those? Or is it both of those? So we might not frame it like that, but we might think, oh, but what is it? What is enlightenment? I don't get it. So is it this or is it that? So what Kema says to him, he says, she says, well then, great king, I will question you about this same matter. Answer as you see fit. What do you think? Do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the grains of sand in the river Ganges? Thus, there are so many grains or so many hundreds of thousands of grains. Do you have someone in your accounts department? Do you have a really good bookkeeper that could tell you that? I don't know if anyone's seen the Ganges, but it's so big you can't actually see the other side. It's like you're looking across the sea. So the king says, well, no, I've got a really good accounts department, but I don't think they can do that. And then he says, she says, do you have an accountant or calculator or mathematician who can count the water in the great ocean thus? So many gallons of water, so many thousands of gallons, or so many hundreds of thousands of gallons of water. No, revered lady. For what reason? Because the great ocean is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom. And so Kema says, so too, great king, all those ways of describing the Tathagata that might describe them has been abandoned by the Tathagata, cut off at the root, no more subject to future arising. The Tathagata is liberated from reckoning in terms of these categories. And she goes through the 5 skandhas, which, if you're not familiar with them, I'm not telling you them now, basically. The Tathagata is deep, immeasurable, hard to fathom, like the great ocean. And then King Pasenadi delights and rejoices in the Bhikkhuni Khema's statement, rises from his seat, pays homage to her, and departs, keeping her on his right, which is the place of honour. So what she's done there is she's not tried to explain it rationally, because she can't, and she hasn't just said there's not an answer to that. She's asked the king a question that has brought him up against the limits of the calculating, conditioned mind that thinks we can understand everything in terms of our current existence. So she's done something where his mind has just gone, wow, it's bigger than that, it's outside my boxes. So in a number of the Therigatha verses, we have this figure of Mara appearing. So, as I say, Mara just pops up and, he's not a devil figure, because, he actually becomes enlightened. He gets converted to the Dharma and becomes enlightened in stories written from after the Buddha dies. But it's more like all the parts of us that want to stop us practicing, that want to derail our practice. And then it gets enacted in this figure of Mara, who, So you could think of Mara as it's like, you sit down to meditate and you think, oh yes, mindfulness of breathing. What's for lunch? I must be planning that holiday. I must book it, because otherwise the cheap flights will go or whatever. I really should have said that to them. What about, I could have said that, but they said that, they were bang out of order. So what is it that Mara says to us? Okay, so that will be a question. What is it Mara says to us? So we have the classics when the Buddha's getting enlightened, where first he tries anger, and you get all the demons coming at the Buddha, and their arrows fall like flowers. And then you get desire, and Mara's daughters come and dance before the Buddha, and then you get doubt. Who do you think you are? But Maras come in many different forms. So you could think, well, what does Mara look like for you? Now here we have Khema and Upalavana encountering Mara. So here's Khema meditating. And Mara takes the form of a beautiful young man. And he sidles up to her and says, come on, Khema. Both of us are young and you are beautiful. Let's enjoy each other. It'll be like the music of a symphony. So basically he's saying, let's get it on. Now Khema says something that will not be, you won't like it by current standards, okay? Just warning you. Khema says, I'm disgusted by this body. It's foul and diseased. It torments me. Your desire for sex means nothing to me. Pleasures of the senses are swords and stakes. Everywhere the love of pleasure is destroyed. The great dark is torn apart. And death, you too are destroyed. I honour the enlightened one, the best of all, and practising his teaching, am completely freed from suffering. So just a couple of points about this, which you can unpack more in the groups. When does craving derail you? Tenzin Palmo, this Cave in the Snow woman, says, loads of people come and ask me how they can get rid of anger and ill will, but nobody comes to me and asks me how they can get rid of desire. So when are we tormented by what we desire? And when do we get derailed by thinking that true and lasting satisfaction is to be found in something or someone out there? Okay, countercultural question. And the thing about body, okay, so in this society we definitely won't find it helpful to be reflecting on our bodies as disgusting. But the question might be, it's such an age of image, social media, selfies, self-presentation. Does our relationship to our body cause us distress? And if so, how can we release those bonds? How can how we look and how we present be less significant to us? Like, what is the direction for freedom for us? And then we have Mara and Upalavanna. So Upalavanna is meditating under a beautiful flowering sal tree. And again, Mara, wearing this form of a very attractive young man, I think we assume heterosexuality here, sidles up to her. But this time he's saying something a bit different. And remember, Upalavanna has a history of being raped. So she's meditating and Mara comes up to her and says, "What a beautiful flowering sal tree under which you have come to stay, alone, without a companion. Are you not afraid of wicked men?" So basically what he's trying to do is he's trying to get her frightened. So the question for us might be, when does fear derail our practice? What fears arise for us? And fear will arise. Whenever we go deeper, a fear will arise. I'm letting go of the familiar. This isn't going to be okay. So when does fear derail us? So Upalavanna says, "Who is this person wanting to frighten me? Is he a human or is he a non-human? Is this person scheming to seduce me?" Having considered it in this way, she realised, this is certainly the wicked Mara. The bad one wants to confound me. And then she says, "Even if there were 100,000 men all scheming to seduce me, just like you, wicked Mara, coming to where I am, they could not stir a hair of mine. I am not afraid of you, wicked Mara." So this is a key point. Mara only has the power we give him. If we stop believing these voices that emerge to derail us, that those voices lose their power. We might think that the kind of the self-criticism or the fear or the desire or the ill will or whatever, it's just going to go away. Actually, in the Buddha's life, it never goes away. Mara always pops up and, these thoughts just sort of pop up. The difference is the Buddha or Upalavanna or Kema just say, "I know you, Mara. This is a fear. This is simply addictive craving." And when we have that level of clarity towards Mara, Mara has no more power. So she says to Mara, "My mind has great might, having well cultivated the psychic powers. Being liberated from the great bondage, I do not fear you, wicked Mara. You should make yourself disappear and go. I am entirely separated from darkness. I dwell in peace. And then this is where Mara ends up being this sort of slightly comic figure. Mara, the bad one, thought, "The Nana Palavana has understood my intentions. Harbouring sadness and worry within, he vanished and was seen no more."
We hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you